Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is that you might happen to be watching this. Thanks for joining us here at Sunday School at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church. We are making our way through the books of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, or the First Testament, whichever one you'd like to call it. Today we have made our way to the prophet Daniel. And there are certain things that you remember about Daniel. Probably everybody who grew up in church remembers Daniel and the lion's den. And people who even didn't grow up in church probably remember Daniel and the lion's den. But there are a lot of other things that are in Daniel that are very important and very significant. And so we'll take a look at some of those today. Here is Daniel in the lion's den, sleeping on one of the lions, so that reminds us. But it also reminds us that Daniel had a variety of dreams. And in those dreams, God spoke to him. And we want to think about that a little bit before the lesson is over, about God speaking to people in dreams. So, the theme of the book is that God is sovereign over all human kingdoms, not just one kingdom, not just the kingdom of Israel, but over all human kingdoms. And it's significant for us to remember that as we go through times of election in our own country, as other countries go through times of unrest. It's important for us to remember that God is the one who is ultimately in control of all of the kingdoms and not us. The book is written by Daniel, according to tradition, in about 535 BC, although later dates have been proposed. The time of the writing of Daniel has been one of the most contested points in all of Old Testament scholarship. And the reason for this is, there's a number of reasons. One is that Daniel is written in two different languages. It's written in Hebrew and in Aramaic. And there are a variety of ideas about why that might have happened. Some have argued that he did that to make some of his language not understandable to the people with whom he was in exile. But we don't know for certain exactly why that happened. But the real problem for many that want to date Daniel much later after the exile, the problem is that Daniel has specific and detailed prophecy in the book. I mean, Daniel has specific prophecy about Alexander the Great coming and overtaking that part of the world. Specific prophecy about Alexander the Great dying and his kingdom that he had overtaken being divided up into four major categories, or by four major areas of power. And it is very, very specific. And as a result of this, some have argued that this is what is called prophecy ex eventu, that is, prophecy after the event. And they argue that this is so incredibly clear and so incredibly accurate that Daniel must have been written after the time of Alexander the Great. And so, traditionally, it's been held that Daniel wrote the book in 535 BC, or right around there, at the time of exile. And that's the position that I take. It is true that his predictions are incredibly accurate, but that all that we have to have is a supernatural worldview in order to say that God can make predictions. There are other predictions in the text of the Bible that are accurate. Jesus' prediction of the destruction of the temple is one example. But there are others. And so we ought not to think that the book has to be timed to after the event, because the predictions, the prophecy is so incredibly accurate. We ought to just say that God, when he prophesies truthfully and accurately. Here we'll show you where Babylon is, and it's beside the river Euphrates, as you can see. The city of Babylon sat right on the river, and the enemies of Babylon were unable to take it because the city had such thick walls around it. but one particularly striking event was when an enemy army dammed up the river and marched underneath the wall where the river had been to take over Babylon. But that happened later on. Here's a timeline of what was going on at the time. It was about 605 when Daniel and some of his friends or colleagues were taken to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Again, this whole book is really, there's dreams all through it. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of a statue, and he wants to make a statue of himself and make everyone bow down to it. And Daniel refuses, and the three other Jewish men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refuse, and as a result, they are thrown into the fiery furnace. Another story that's in Daniel. Then Daniel sees a vision of 4 beasts. Daniel sees a vision of a ram and a goat. Daniel interprets the handwriting on the wall for Belshazzar. This is another famous story and has made its way into our culture today as a saying that I can't believe that they didn't see the handwriting on the wall. It comes from the book of Daniel when they were drinking out of the cups that they had taken from the temple, and a hand came and wrote on the wall, and we'll look at that in a few moments. Then Gabriel gives Daniel the message of 70 weeks. This has to do with when the Messiah is coming, and you can work that out mathematically and see that Daniel is making a specific prediction about when Jesus is coming. Then Daniel is thrown into the lion's den. We've heard about that. Probably it's the most famous story in Daniel. The Babylonians kept these lions probably for the specific purpose of putting people into the den to put them to death. And as a result, clearly they expected Daniel to be dead. But Daniel wasn't dead, and as a result of that, he was respected among many of the Babylonians. And then finally, Daniel sees his last vision in about 536 BC. So let's take a look at what's in the book of Daniel that will help us to understand what's really going on there. The first sort of section that we can see is the section of preparation. There's a historical setting that tells us about Daniel being taken out of his own land into exile. The fact that they're put into a training school. He and other boys are put into a training school, and they're told exactly what they are supposed to eat in this school. But Daniel makes a commitment and won't eat that. And as a result, they say, well, if you're stronger than the other people who are in this training school, we will let you eat your own diet. And as a result, God equips him, and he is stronger, even though he refused to eat the Babylonian meals. Then in chapter 2 is when we get to Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And Nebuchadnezzar asks about what's going on with this dream to the astrologers, and they fail to understand it. And then Daniel intercedes and tells him, because Daniel is in many ways like Joseph. He is able to tell people what their dreams mean. And Daniel then relates the dream and interprets the dream because that's his gifting from God. He can understand dreams and interpret the dreams of other people, just as Joseph was able to do. As a result of Daniel being able to interpret the dream, Daniel is promoted. And so we can see certain allusions to the life of Joseph. Joseph interpreted dreams. Joseph is promoted as a result of the fact that he's able to interpret those dreams. Then the next thing that happens in chapter 3 is the fiery furnace. And everyone is commanded to worship Nebuchadnezzar's idol when a trumpet blows. And there are 3 people that refused, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we don't know where Daniel was at this point, or maybe he wasn't outside during the trumpet blowing, we're not certain. But these three are condemned to the fiery furnace, and they are ordered to make the furnace so hot that it will kill people who even get near it. And they are thrown into this fiery furnace, and it's this amazing story. Nebuchadnezzar says, didn't we put 3 people into the fiery furnace? But now I see 4 people, one of them who looks like the Son of Man. And so there's this Son of Man passage in Daniel that many believe refers to God being in there with them, or Jesus being in there with them. And Jesus' favorite self-designation in the Gospels is the Son of Man. Now we have to sort of think that through, because in the Septuagint there are 2 different streams of text. So if you bought a Greek Old Testament called the Septuagint, and you looked in the book of Daniel, you would find that there comes a place where it's divided, and there are 2 different things, and one of them doesn't say anything about the Son of Man. I won't go into that just because it's technical, but in the Hebrew, we certainly see the Son of Man. And as a result of the fact that these 3 boys are not burned up, Nebuchadnezzar honors the Lord. And it's an amazing thing. And he's humbled by the fact that God has really preserved the people who claim to be worshipers of Yahweh. Nebuchadnezzar then has a second dream, and he describes the dream. And Daniel warns the king about something that's going to happen to him. He warns him that you're going to end up like a wild animal if you're not careful. And the king is punished by going out and eating grass and things like that, and then he repents. Then there is King Belshazzar's feast. Again, what's happening during this feast is that when they took all of the people from Israel, the nation of Israel, into exile, or Judah if you want to be more specific, they also took with them anything of value. And there were valuable cups and plates made out of gold in the temple. So they took those with them. And during this tremendous party that they're having, a hand begins to write on the wall. Just a hand by itself, a hand shows up, and it writes, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upraisen. And so they call Daniel to try and interpret the writing. And Daniel says that your kingdom is going to fall. You are weighed in the balances and found wanting, is literally what Daniel says in the old King James. That there is a scale, and God has put you on the scale, and you are found not weighing enough. You need help. You're found wanting. So Daniel is honored for that. And the king loves Daniel because of the things that he has done and the way that he's been able to show the people the truth of what they are doing. And he's been able to show the people the truth of what their dreams mean. He's been a very good and careful and accurate interpreter of the dreams. But then there comes a time when the king is forced, almost against his will, to put Daniel in the lion's den. And it happens because of a conspiracy. In the first 9 verses of chapter 6, you can read about the conspiracy that caused Daniel to be put into the lion's den, and the sentence that happened in spite of the fact that the king did not want this kind of thing to take place. But when Daniel is put into the lion's den, essentially what they would do, as far as we can tell, these were wild lions, and often they wouldn't be fed for days at a time. And they would put them behind a wall and put the person who was going to be put to death by the lions into another part of the den on the other side of the wall, and then they would lift that wall up. and the lions would come rushing and tear the person to pieces. At least that's what they expected. The next morning, when they came to see what the lions had done to Daniel and whether or not they had torn him to pieces like they expected, they realized that Daniel had been delivered. And again, this is that same, remember the same theme that we are seeing, that Daniel shows us that God is over all nations, not just one nation, but all nations. And he's over all people and even all animals. And so when God does not want the lions to eat Daniel, then they don't. This is, from this point on, it changes. The book changes from a book about events that happen in the exile to dreams and their interpretation that Daniel has. So Daniel has a vision of the four kingdoms. And if you remember your history, Alexander the Great died young, but he had a huge empire. And when he died, he said, whoever is strongest, take the empire. Well, the empire was divided into four different areas of power. And as a result, Daniel talks about these four beasts. They are the four areas of power that came to be after the death of Alexander. But Daniel also sees a vision of God's triumph. And an angel interprets that for him. He comes down and tells Daniel what it means. Then Daniel sees a vision of a ram, a goat, and a little horn. And the vision is described very clearly. And then again, an angel, but this time we learn what the angel's name is. His name is Gabriel, interprets that vision. Then Daniel has the dream of the 70 weeks. And God grants him, as Daniel is praying, God grants him the knowledge of the Messiah's time. And that's what the 70 weeks essentially are to be understood as. They are to be understood, Daniel's 70 weeks, as the time from the time of Daniel until the time that the Messiah comes. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but there are ways to work that out. And if you get a good commentary on Daniel, it will show you what that's about with those 70 weeks and how that all works out. Daniel, though, is a persistent person of prayer. That's the reason that he was thrown into the lion's den, was because he prayed in front of the open window, even though he had been commanded not to. And so during these prayers, he has these visions. And this is a really interesting part of Daniel, where Daniel is praying, and he's praying for God's messenger. And the text says that God's angel messenger was delayed because he was fighting against evil forces. It's a really interesting sort of little glimpse into the unseen world in which we live, where there are beings, good beings and evil beings, fighting against one another. And it's here that we see that Daniel's continued and persistent prayer enabled the angel to win and to finally come and speak to him. Then Daniel begins to realize that there's tribulation ahead. There's tribulation for the Persian Empire, which was essentially Alexander the Great's empire. There's a number of wars that are going to follow. There's going to be persecution of the Jews. Daniel says this even though those around him were not very happy about it. And he talks about a latter-day great persecution. Many see this as what is called in the New Testament the Great Tribulation. But whether that is what Daniel is specifically speaking about or not it depends upon whom you ask. Then Daniel talks about the rise and the fall of the Antichrist. One of the things that you should realize is that people often get mistaken the Antichrist and the beast in Revelation. There are many antichrists. in the New Testament, John says there are many antichrists. That is those who hate Christ, who try to work against the kingdom of God, who try to do all the evil that they can. So the rise and fall of the Antichrist is not the same. And people often use the term Antichrist, and what they mean is the beast spoken of in Revelation 13. So to put that in our own context, I think it's certainly fair to call someone like Hitler an Antichrist, or Mussolini an Antichrist, because they were working against the kingdom of God. They were doing horrible things to people. They were uncaring about the fact that every person carries with them the image of God. So there is then tribulation and triumph. Daniel speaks about the great tribulation that will come, but he also speaks about the resurrection and the judgment. And he finally is commissioned in the final part of the final chapter of Daniel 12. So it's not a long book. It won't take you a long time to read it, but it's a book that demands much study. There has been a lot of ink spilled about the book of Daniel in the modern theological world. And that much of it has to do with what Daniel exactly meant when he interprets dreams, or what he exactly meant when the angels come and explain those kinds of things to him. But I wanted for us to spend a little bit of time thinking about a question. And the question is a simple one, but the question is, does God speak to people in dreams today? That is, could you say, God told me in a dream such and such, and expect people to take that just as they took Joseph, or just as they took Daniel? There are three positions that across the spectrum in terms of dreams. There are some who would say absolutely not, that God's special revelation ended with the Bible. Therefore, remember that there are two different kinds of revelation. Special revelation is the Bible, where God speaks to us. General revelation, or natural revelation, is the world that we see outside, the trees and the order of the universe, and all of that is God naturally revealing himself, but it takes special revelation to know specifically about God. So there are those who will argue that any of these kinds of speaking in tongues, or miracles of God speaking in dreams, and all of that ended with the ending of the Bible. There are others who will say possibly, maybe in areas where there is no preacher or no Bible, that God might speak to people through dreams. An example of this is that if you've ever met a Muslim who has become a Christian, often they will say, God appeared to me in a dream and said, Jesus is the true God. Or Jesus appeared to me in a dream and said that he is the true prophet. And I certainly would never want to say that that's not God speaking to them. God can do whatever he wants to. And it may be that that's the method that God uses in places where people don't have the opportunity to listen to Christian preaching, or Christian radio, or Christian television, and that they don't have a Bible. God speaks to them through a dream. There are others on the charismatic side of the spectrum who would say absolutely. If God spoke through dreams in the past, then he still speaks through dreams today. But the dreams, they would say, must be in line with the Bible. It can't just be any dream. And the problem is that there are times when people misuse this by, a guy coming up to a girl and saying, I had a dream and God told me that we were supposed to be married. I once had a guy come up to me and say, I had a dream that God told me you were going to give us this building. It was a building that we had at a church. And I said, if he tells me about it, I'll let you know. Because I had had no such dream nor any such idea about what was going on there. So one must be careful about simply saying that, anybody can have a dream and say that as a word from God. That's not really the way that the text seems to tell us. So we therefore, and I want to give you a couple of historical theologians, and tell you what they say about this dreams. This is John Calvin. We therefore now answer our adversaries as Augustine then answered the Donatists. Donatism was a heresy in the early church, and Augustine spends a great deal of time answering them. So Augustine says to the Donatists, John Calvin says, the Lord made us wary of those miracle workers when he predicted that false prophets with lying signs and prodigies would come to draw even the elect, if possible, into error. And so John Calvin he doesn't say it never happens, at least here, but he says we must be very careful about it, and that we shouldn't just think that somebody can say that they had a dream and that God is really speaking to them. Here is C.S. Lewis on the other side of the spectrum. God does not shake miracles into nature at random, as if from a pepper caster. They come on great occasions. They are found at the great ganglions of history, not of political or social history, but of that spiritual history which cannot be fully known by men. If your own life does not happen to be near one of those great times, how should you expect to see one? And so Lewis is saying there that these things happen here and there, but they don't happen very often, and they only happen in particular times. There was a Bible translator named J.B. Phillips who claimed that after C.S. Lewis's death, C.S. Lewis came to visit him as what we would call a ghost, and gave him some specific piece of information that he needed to hear, specifically from C.S. Lewis. And so, what are we to say to that kind of thing? I don't know. I can only say that God can do whatever he wants to, but that we must be very, very careful about some kind of continuing revelation, because we are saying through that revelation that God is continuing to speak, and God has spoken in the Bible, and we must be careful about allowing other things that seem to be special revelation. So, read the book of Daniel, think about this question of dreams for yourself, and maybe do a little work on the internet or in some books that you have about whether or not dreams should be thought of today as they were during the biblical times, because dreams were used a lot, not just in Joseph and Daniel, but remember Joseph, the husband of Mary, learned about what he was supposed to do in a dream. Mary learned that she was going to have the Messiah in a dream. So the dreams were very significant even in the New Testament. So next week we'll move on past Daniel, and we'll think about what a couple of other prophets have to say to us, prophets that are not generally spent a lot of time on. And it will be a time when we can read through these smaller prophets for our own benefit. And maybe you haven't read these very much. Maybe you've never read the book of Daniel, and all you know about is the lion's den or the fiery furnace. So take a little time, read through this book, and I'm sure that the Lord will bless you. Thank you so much for being here with us today at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church, and I pray that the Lord will bless you with these messages, and that he will cause you to know more and more about his word. So I will see you next week. So long from Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church.